government's abuse of private property rights. The defendants, Reed and Kendall, here today as representatives to support the actions of the government's use of eminent domain. All rise for the Honorable Judge Emery Dorniak.
One of the most controversial topics facing landowners in the U.S. is that of eminent domain. This issue is one that is constantly in our news and of importance to our legislation. Across the United States, people are fighting to pass legislation that would place limits on the government's power to take private land. Quite a few of the arguments we face come from our Texas landowners. They state that eminent domain law needs reform because it is nowhere near strong enough. The government bullies the landowners and that there is great financial and emotional strain placed upon them. On the government side, it is stated that, on the contrary, eminent domain law is indeed strong enough. The government is fair in their dealings, and that the government has put many bills in place to protect landowners. I reviewed the case. Order in the court. As I was saying, I reviewed the case, and both sides have valid argument to discuss in the court today. Today, our prosecutors and defendants will discuss in their views in answering the question of, do Texans need eminent domain reform?
Your Honor, as a representative of the people, I would like you to understand our point of view, beginning with con point 1. The government needs to stand up for the people and get the use of eminent domain right. Time and time again, bills are proposed to make eminent domain better, but time and time again, nothing happens, and our landowners are the ones who are truly at a loss. This past legislative session, Senator Lois Corcourse's Senate Bill 421 sought to better protect property owners but didn't pass. According to Texas Tribune, this is the third consecutive session in which Corcourse has filed eminent domain legislation. Third consecutive session. Your Honor, that has to be a sign that we need to get the use of eminent domain right.
I agree with my counterpart. While I understand the necessity of eminent domain, I do not agree on the government's misuse of it. Eminent domain in the condemnation process is not a willing buyer and willing seller transition. It is a legally forced sale. Therefore, it is necessary to consider further improvements to the laws that govern the use of eminent domain so that Texas landowners can have more assurance this process is fair and respectful of their private property rights when they are forced to relinquish their land. Landowners need and deserve fairness, accountability, and transparency when their property is taken with eminent domain. Property takers are not required to offer enough information for a good decision. If ever a process called for more transparency, this is it.
Although I don't doubt that you have been respectfully informed on the point of getting eminent domain right, Your Honor, but I feel that it is necessary to share the government's point of view on the subject. Our first pro point is that eminent domain is working. Our number one priority and point of interest is, and has always been, the people of Texas as a whole. It is our job to perform a tedious balancing act between keeping up with and fulfilling the call for advancement from growing populations as well as satisfying its residents. Eminent domain allows us to do that. Eminent domain also allows for utilities to be expanded into new areas, as well as oil and other goods to be transported in a safe way. In essence, eminent domain should enhance the growth of the local area, thus benefiting everyone.
The Texas Constitution states, no person's property may be taken, damaged, or destroyed, or applied to public use without adequate compensation. This provision of the Texas Constitution provides broader protection than the U.S. Constitution because it includes a reference to damaged or destroyed property. Thus, the state of Texas and its political subdivisions are prohibited from taking private property and using it for non-public purposes. Because of these limitations, the Texas legislature nor local governments are authorized to make laws or ordinances that run contrary to these constitutionally guaranteed protections. The government's job is to accommodate the growing population and in respect to the individual owner's wants. In the end, what the government does is what the benefit of the people is. Therefore, eminent domain laws are adequate and working.
Imagine I came to negotiate something, and before I said a word, I took out a gun and placed it on the table in front of me. Would I be negotiating like a gentleman or like a thug? Eminent domain is like putting a gun out on the table. Does that bring things into perspective? The government doesn't negotiate, and that brings me to con point 2. Before the manipulation began, the original purpose of eminent domain was to establish places in which the government could work efficiently. The design of eminent domain allowed the government to seize a person's land if they were paid enough for it. But who decides what enough is? Ideally, just compensation should make the landowner whole again. In other words, place the owner in the same relative position as if the taking did not occur.
However, we've never seen a case where just compensation left the landowner in the same relative position as if the taking did not occur. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution states, "Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation." It is in our constitutional right to have just compensation. Yet, that is probably the vaguest part of eminent domain. When determining just compensation, the government sends out an appraiser that they hire. The appraiser then determines the value of the land, in most cases lowballing an offer to the landowner. Texas uses a broad instruction approach to determine valuation. This approach doesn't provide a lot of guidance on what compensation should be based on. Texas farmers, ranchers, and rural property holders have a constitutional right to fair treatment and just compensation, with clarification on just compensation in eminent domain reform.
Since we're on the topic of just compensation, we would like to share our viewpoint. A landowner cannot have their land taken from them without just compensation. Just compensation refers to the compensation an individual receives when the property gets seized by the government for public use. Just compensation is given to the landowner in terms of current fair market value. Contrary to beliefs of others, the government is fair in their dealings and does their best to appeal to the party that is faced with losing the property. Land is not taken without repayment to the owner for the property. Landowners that are put into this unfortunate situation are not only paid for the land, but the government will compensate you for additional expenses, such as moving expenses, direct losses as a result of the move, and reasonable expenses from searching for replacement property.
People want to believe that the government is the bad guy and just taking away the people's land. But in reality, they're thinking of what will be better in the long run and compensating the landowner rightfully. When determining just compensation in eminent domain, the government hires an appraiser. The appraiser determines the value of the land, the value of added land features, and the impact, including severance damages. The offer is then made to the landowner, who would consult their attorney to make sure the offer is fair. Both the government and the landowner have a say and come to an agreement.
Your Honor, I appreciate your time and would like to conclude this discussion with con point 3, the loss of land for our Texas landowners. Texans take pride in their private property. Over 95% of land in the Lone Star State is privately owned. The National Resource Inventory estimates that 1,812,700 acres of agricultural land was converted to developed land. That's an average annual rate of 362,540 acres per year, which equates to nearly an acre a minute, or more than 40 acres every hour. What is going to happen to our agriculture if the government continues to abuse its rights of eminent domain? Much of the land in rural areas is owned by farmers who depend upon their land for their livelihood. If they lose their land, they lose much more than simply a home or a commercial building. Instead, they lose years of hard work, building up operations that likely cannot be recreated in another location. Once this prime farmland has been re-landscaped, its service in global human food production will be lost forever.
In Texas, a good deal of agricultural land is leased out to tenants that either farm or raise livestock on the land. Oftentimes, a pipeline company may not even be aware that a lease agreement exists on a property. In that instance, the company may negotiate with the owner, reach an agreement, pay the agreed upon just compensation without ever hearing a word about there being a leasehold interest at stake. This can leave a tenant in an unenviable position of having paid to lease land that is now going to be disturbed due to the construction of a pipeline, and not receiving any portion of the proceeds paid by the pipeline company. Texas farmers, ranchers,
There is not a city in Texas or the United States that isn't expanding to meet the needs of our growing population, which is our third and final pro point. Sometimes land needs to be taken for good things. Infrastructure, roads, railroads, pipelines, and electrical transmission lines. are for the good of the public as a whole. The government has put in place several bills specifically to help secure people's property and to help landowners better understand the proceedings. For instance, Texas Landowners' Bill of Rights consists of 10 basic principles stating that private property can only be taken for public use and must go through a process of law. If eminent domain wasn't a governmental power, certain improvements would be impossible to implement.
Rarely does eminent domain get the credit for the positive things that have been accomplished through its use. Without it, our urban areas would be places without the great virtues of conformity and sensible land use. In rural environments, everyone agrees that it would be a justifiable sacrifice to take a rancher's land to be able to build dams and lakes to provide water supply and electrical power to our city's millions. When the frenzy dies down, most thoughtful Americans understand that it was sensible for the government to condemn land, or otherwise known as acquiring property through the power of eminent domain. For many reasons, we, the defendants, don't think that it is necessary for eminent domain reform.
I now have new insight to the positives and negatives of eminent domain on Texas landowners. Both parties have defended their thoughts on eminent domain. The prosecutor stated that eminent domain reform is not fair. The prosecutor stated eminent domain laws are vague. Just compensating isn't fair and the loss of land. While our defendants argued that eminent domain law is fair. Fair market value is appropriate, and the land being acquired is for the good of the land, of the public. Would either side like to make a closing statement?
It's well known that Texas property owners continue to struggle with the eminent domain process in a variety of ways, and it's paramount that they have greater assurance that the eminent domain process be fair, transparent, and respectful.
On the contrary, eminent domain doesn't need reform. It is a concept that comes to us from the United States Constitution. The Fifth Amendment provides that no one may take private property for public use without just compensation.
After hearing the final testimonies, I believe that both sides have valid points. Each swing of the pendulum is colored by unique historical events and sentiments that drive this movement forward or against. Taking this into consideration, I believe that this matter cannot be resolved in the courtroom today. Yes, the public needs land for their use, but in turn, the power of eminent domain should not be abused. Therefore, we will conclude this session and continue at a later date with the jury present. Thank you.